I love the rain. I love the sound it makes. I love walking in it. It brings me a kind of inner peace that I don't really experience in any other kind of weather condition. But what about this? What if it started raining and never stopped? How would you feel about that? How would it affect your life? And in my time, I've been in certain countries during the monsoon season, and as much as I love rain, there are times when you just wish it would stop. But what if it didn't? Well, that's the dilemma in tonight's story, my dear friends. So once again, it's time to sit back and relax with your favourite drink and listen. I patiently awaited by the riverbanks, while Charlie went to relieve himself behind a barren tree. The rain poured hard towards the poisoned earth, ripping away any life that dared settle in the ground. The waters before me were murky, and the river flowed relentlessly. They had once been so full of life, surrounded by families enjoying their picnics, tanning in the sun. Now nothing more than a watery grave, destroyed by the ever-present acid rain. It was odd, though, that despite the storm, it hadn't grown in size. It had remained the same monotonous body of water, only disturbed by the occasional piece of driftwood floating downstream. "Charlie, hurry up, it's getting dark," I yelled to my son as I started getting impatient. "I'm trying," he shouted back. I couldn't blame him. Taking a piss was harder than one would have thought, while soaking wet and freezing cold. He turned silent, and I decided to give him some space while I rested by the riverbank. My body had grown frail in the past year, after the supplies diminished. Both food and water had become a scarce, invaluable resource. I thought it was ironic that we would most likely die from starvation or dehydration, all the while soaking wet from the sulphuric piss falling down from above. My train of thought was disrupted by what seemed like an oddly shaped tree stump approaching from up the river. I fixed my attention to it as it drifted closer, and then realized it wasn't a piece of wood, but a corpse. "Oh, fuck it, not again," I mumbled to myself. It had been flayed from top to bottom, not an inch of skin remaining on its bloody surface. Behind it followed another dozen dead bodies, all floating peacefully on top of the water, in various stages of mutilation. All were skinned, but some had additional avulsions, missing arms, legs, even heads that had been violently torn from some of their bodies. At that point, their identities were nothing more than a distant memory, an unimportant detail. They all seemed the same underneath their skin, and now they just added to the pile of corpses in the hellscape of a city that we called home. Those people were the brave ones, the ones that had tried to leave, but they'd known the risk. They knew about the Guardians, yet they ventured across the wall, and now they were just pieces of meat flowing with the river. The way their bodies bobbed up and down in the water reminded me, in the most morbid way, of times long since past, of the days before the rain. Taking Charlie to the beach with his mother, teaching him how to swim. I almost let myself smile despite the horrific sight, but I was quickly jolted back to reality as one of the corpses landed on the riverbank, fully clothed and seemingly unharmed. "Charlie, get over here," I called as I ran for the corpse. It was a man in his early 20s, thick, long hair and well-fed. Wherever the river had taken him from, he definitely didn't belong in the city. I checked his pulse, barely finding a weak one, and, though unconscious, he was definitely alive. "Dad, what are you doing?" Charlie asked. "We've got a live one. Hand me the blanket." Charlie pulled out a soaking wet piece of cloth, hardly protected from the weather by the bag, but it was all we had. I wrapped the man in it as well as I could, before lifting him up over my shoulder. "Dad, what if he's like the others?" Charlie asked nervously. "He can't be. He looks too healthy. Help me carry my things while I carry him. We have to get back to the shelter, fast." We rushed back towards the ruin we called home for the past day. It only took an hour to walk through the storm, but in my fragile state, carrying someone as heavy as that man, well, it put me on the brink of collapse. Once we finally reached the house, I dropped the man on the driest part of the floor I could find. While Charlie unpacked our things, I started a futile attempt at making a fire. "Dad, I'm going to look for food," Charlie stated, oddly confident. He'd become a resourceful kid, but I had little hope that we'd find any treasure. Whoever lived there before had to have emptied the place during the second evacuation. "Don't bother. We already looked through this place." As a stubborn kid, he reminded me of his mother, always adamant about finding solutions where there were none. Against my advice, he set off to search the house once more. After a good half an hour, I managed to get a few sparks to ignite a fire. Charlie returned just in time, holding a few cans of beans and a couple of water bottles. "Where'd you find those?" I asked, equally impressed and surprised. "Found them under some old planks in the closet," he said, smiling. People had gotten clever during the storm. As food supplies grew short and we lost contact with the outside world, people got serious about hiding their most valuable belongings. And in a world where nothing ever grew, where food couldn't be made, gold and money had lost their purpose. "You did good, Charlie. I'm proud of you." The man grunted, starting to wake up. "What happened?" he asked weakly. I knelt down beside him, trying my best to keep him calm. "Don't worry, you're safe," I said. "What's your name?" "Peter." "Great, Peter. I'm John. Do you know where you are?" "No, I was just out walking," he groaned. "Oh, my head, it really hurts." I noticed a gash on the back of his head, covered by his hair. It had stopped bleeding, but it was a nasty cut in risk of getting infected. "Was I in an accident? Why am I not in a hospital?" he asked. "Hospital?" I asked back, confused. Before he could continue, he passed back out. I tried to get him to drink some water, most of which he coughed up. Keeping him warm and hydrated was all I could do while he recovered. Asking for a hospital? He must have been pretty out of it, I mumbled to myself. I turned back to Charlie. He was enjoying his expired can of beans, our first meal in 2 days. Hardly a feast, but that didn't matter. "Well, we all need to get some sleep soon, Charlie. We've got a long trek ahead of us tomorrow." "Wait, tell me the story first," he demanded. It was a story I'd told 1,000 times in the past few years. One of the times before the storm. A story about a world Charlie was far too young to remember, but he'd seen a minuscule part of it. I wanted to keep that glimpse alive, if only as a distant dream. "You want to hear about the sun?" I asked. He nodded eagerly. "All right, come sit with me. Let's try to get dry before we pass out for the night." We huddled up under the blanket, almost dry from the fire, and for the 1,001st time, I told him about the past. "You know, the sky's blue. Beyond the darkness and thick clouds we see outside, there's a whole other world without rain, without thunder and lightning, and in the center of all, we have the sun. It's a bright yellow ball hanging up there, watching over us, keeping us warm. Even now it's giving us life, but it's not as strong as it used to be. It's hidden, like an invaluable treasure. Many years ago, we lived in the sun with your mother. We were so happy." I paused for a moment. Talking about my wife was a hard task, considering how we'd lost her. Charlie didn't remember, of course, but it stung deep inside my chest, like a cold hand wrapping around my aching heart. I sighed before I continued. "Oh, she loved to take us out to the beach, endless oceans and soft sand beneath our feet. It was so warm and so bright that we had to eat ice cream just to cool down. Sometimes we even wanted to get wet. We dove into the water, but they weren't dark and grimy. No, they were crystal clear, blue like the color of your eyes. But it's all gone now, isn't it?" I'm sure it's out there somewhere, and I promise you, as soon as we can find a way past the Guardians, I'll take you there. You'll see the sun again, Charlie. I promise. I talked more about his mother until he fell asleep. As much as it pained me, I felt it important that he knew what a wonderful woman she was. As night fell over us, the storm worsened, turning from heavy rain to a murderous blizzard. As usual, I found it hard to sleep, always worrying the house might collapse, as so many buildings had done before. But Charlie slept blissfully, too young to comprehend the true dangers of the world. Dad, the man's waking up. I awoke to Charlie shaking me. Though I was usually a light sleeper, I somehow barely came to, even as Charlie yelled. Peter was coughing, begging for water. After spending the whole night unconscious, he was finally coming back to it. Water, please, he said. I helped him sit up to drink. How are you feeling? Oh, man, I'm still here. I thought it was all a dream, he said as he looked around the room. Are we in an abandoned house or something? Well, Peter, it's not abandoned anymore, I joked, stupidly trying to brighten up the mood. Shouldn't I be in a hospital? He asked again. I was confused, but he'd suffered a fairly traumatic head injury, so I let his question slide while I started breakfast. I cooked up some beans and offered them to Peter. Without supplies, I couldn't do much for his wound, only observe and hope a fever didn't fester. Do you know where we are? I asked, trying to get an idea of his state of mind. I don't know. I don't remember anything other than walking around. I was heading for a picnic, I think. Then there was a bright flash, and next thing I know, I wake up here. A picnic? Yeah, it's been the warmest summer in years, they say. Oh, I wanted to enjoy the weather, but by the look of that rain outside, I guess that didn't last very long. Warm summer. Picnics. Oh, it had become clear how confused he really was. We're in Greenville, I said. Greenville? I've never heard that name. I come from Portland. It wasn't a place I'd heard about nearby. Closest town over would have been Clint, but God knows what still existed beyond the boundaries of our hellhole. And you have sun in Portland? Yeah, blazing, burning sun. Every day for the past month. For a moment I considered the fact that the world had kept going long after our city's demise, that, despite our hardship, there existed a better place where life thrived. Yet, I knew leaving would be impossible. You're telling me the world is still going? That outside of this shit, people are just living normal lives? Of course. We never even heard about a storm destroying a city. No one knows about Greenville, but this is all a bit bizarre. I stood up and paced around the room, 1,000 thoughts and ideas flowing through my mind. The world hadn't ended. It was only us, only our city, closed off from the rest of the world and left to suffer. People couldn't leave, but then again, none had entered it either. Since the fall of our city and collapse of the colony, Peter was the first seemingly healthy human we'd stumbled across. If he could get in then, maybe, just maybe, we could get out. Dad, there's a woman outside, Charlie yelled from one of the windows, breaking me away from my brainstorm. Stay back, Charlie, I demanded as I rushed outside. Peter was getting up and following suit. The rain poured as always, filling up a smaller sinkhole down the end of the street. Most houses had long since collapsed, and those that still stood were slowly being etched away by the acid. A woman stood in the middle of the street, with her back facing towards us. She wore nothing more than a light dress, hardly providing protection from the horrific weather. She'd been hurt, leaving an exposed wound on her left shoulder, no longer bleeding but oozing with thick, yellow pus. What the hell is she doing, just standing there? Peter asked. Don't get close. "Let me deal with it," I responded. I walked up behind the woman. The veins on her arm were protruding out, marking an infection that was growing up towards her neck. She was on the brink of sepsis and would soon perish. Without hesitating, I pulled her head back by her hair. As I did, I also lifted up my hunting knife and slit her throat. "I'm sorry," I whispered as blood poured down her newly created orifice. She didn't even react as she quickly bled out. Seconds later, she died. "Holy shit! What the fuck did you just do?" Peter yelled from the house. He stood, frozen in fear, staring at my bloody hands. He didn't understand what I'd just done. It then dawned on me that Peter truly came from a better place, one without the daily horrors that we faced. "I set her free," I responded, already out of breath. Peter turned to run, but I gave chase. Despite my malnourished body and wasted frame, I was far faster in the rain and quickly pinned him down. "Let me go! You're crazy!" he yelled. "Calm down, Peter. You don't understand. I can explain." "Explain what? You just murdered someone," he continued. I let him go, causing him to slip onto the muddy, wet ground. I kept my knife pointed at him, forcing him to stick around a little longer. "You really don't know what's going on here, do you?" I asked. "Please, don't kill me. Just tell me what you want." "Of course I won't kill you. You're not an empty, not like them. Well, not yet." I flipped my knife around, gesturing for Peter to take it. "Now that I'm unarmed, you're going to listen." He took the knife, clutching onto it with shaking hands. It put me in harm's way, but I felt safe nonetheless. Peter wasn't from around Greenfield. He'd been sheltered, safe from the nightmare that had been our lives for the past few years, meaning he still didn't have murder in his heart. "Why did you kill her?" he asked with a shaky voice. "Because she was already dead. The parts of her that matters anyway. You noticed the wound on her arm, her clear apathy towards it? It's because she's one of them. One of the empty people." "What do you mean by empty people?" I walked back over to the corpse of the thing I'd just killed, turning her over to see her face. Full of scratches, even an eye missing, probably from walking into walls and debris lying around. "It's the rain," I said calmly while presenting the wounds of someone who'd clearly given up on their own well-being. "It changes people, hollows them out. At first, they just stop caring, but then it takes away their memories and strips them of all emotion. That's the fate of most people living in this city, and whatever they once were, accountants, mechanics, doctors, well, they ain't anymore. All they do now is walk around, get hurt, and die." "Then why kill them?" "Because they're already gone. Only their bodies stay behind to suffer. The least we can do is set them free. Besides, they get riled up if disturbed, and sometimes they get violent." He'd lowered his guard by then, either from believing my story or because he simply didn't have much of a choice. Peter was trapped alongside us in the storm, unable to survive without my help, but, unbeknownst to him, he could be our ticket out of here. "How long have you been here?" was all he asked. 7 years. Peter collapsed to the ground in disbelief, fearing he'd suffer the same fate. I walked over and put a comforting hand on his shoulder, mustering as much confidence as I could into the next few words. "But now, we're all getting out of here, together." My plan was simple enough in theory. Follow the river and retrace its path back towards where it grabbed Peter. It might have given us a safe way past the Guardians lurking in the dark territory. While we got ready for the day's trek, I felt hopeful. For the first time in about 6 years, I truly believed we stood a chance. The mere fact that Peter got inside ignited a fresh wave of hope throughout my body. It meant there had to be a weak spot in the dark territory, one we could escape through. Charlie presented us with a few water bottles he found while searching the neighbouring houses. It wasn't much to keep us going, but I'd found a new source of motivation anyway. "So, we're leaving the city?" Peter asked. "That's right. If a better place exists, I have to get my son there." "Mind me asking why you haven't left already? I mean, this place isn't all that great." "Because it's dangerous, Peter. People have tried and died." "What makes you so sure we'll survive then?" he asked, looking at me with a mix of fear and confusion. "Because now we know it's possible. You got in. That means we can get out." During the early days of the storm, we'd all been part of a mass evacuation. As the first buildings fell to sinkholes that were created by the downpour, people started to panic. The evacuation itself was a shit show. Thousands of cars immediately congested on the highway. As a last resort, we attempted to flee on foot, with the pitch-black clouds looming above us, striking down with lightning ever so often, seeming to appear from the ground itself. My family and I were quite far in the back, and when reaching the border out of the city, we halted in our steps. Before us lay thousands of skinless bodies, entire families embraced in death, with horrified expressions on their flayed faces. In the blink of an eye, well over 100,000 people had been slaughtered, repurposed for a meat wall spanning around the entire city, keeping us trapped. A few more bodies had landed on the riverbank where we'd found Peter the day before. Unlike him, they were beyond saving, flayed and mutilated like all the others. Peter looked at them in disbelief and disgust, unable to comprehend the horrors that lay before him. "What happened to them?" he asked. "Those are the people that try to leave," I said. "And that's where we're heading," he continued, panicked. "I don't think I can do this." "Listen to me, Peter. There's no food, no water, nothing left in this city for us. We either take our chances here, or we die from thirst, starvation, or infection in the city. Remember that you made it in here, and I promise you a better chance if we just keep going." We followed the river upstream, half a day's trek just to get to the bridge. The rest would be spent crossing it. The bridge was the name given to a collection of sinkholes spanning all around the city, 96 miles wide and 2 miles across. A place of destruction, almost impossible to pass. A section of the sinkholes had been covered in various debris, cars and corpses, giving it the unfitting name. Filling it to the brim, to the point where we could cross, hence a bridge. Despite its dangerous content, it would be our safest route to the other side. Of course, the empty people lurked around the bridge as well, but they were different. Those that existed there still had the basic instinct of escaping, making them far more terrifying than anything found within the city limits. I let my mind wander as we slowly walked by the river. The monotonous flow of water against the harsh trickle of rain was somehow soothing. It brought back memories of the second evacuation and the first empty people. I saw an image of myself, holding on to my 3-year-old son with one arm and my wife with the other. We were crushed in the middle of a panicking crowd when my wife, Loretta, suddenly let go. I tried so desperately to grab hold of her again, but she simply stood there, letting the crowd trample her down as we were pulled away. She was left behind, one of the first people to forget themselves, to hollow out and become one of the empty people. Most could feel it coming on. They knew they were about to turn, but not her. For whatever reason, it happened within seconds. Following the second failed evacuation, we searched for weeks. Hundreds of colonists looking for their lost loved ones, but to no avail. Loretta was more than likely one of the empties that wandered into harm's way, dying from their own neglect. "Dad, what are you doing?" Charlie asked as I snapped back to reality. I'd stopped moving, lost in my own thoughts, unable to react to the outside world. "Dad!" "John!" Peter chimed in. Finally, I managed to get myself going. "I'm sorry. I just needed to catch my breath," I lied. "Let's keep moving." Another hour, we finally reached the bridge. Before us, we saw an endless collection of sinkholes, partially filled with solid debris, dozens of bodies littering the pits among a few surviving stragglers. "This isn't exactly what I had in mind when you said we had to cross a bridge," Peter said. The river ran straight through the sinkholes, dragging parts of its foundation with it. We had to keep a certain distance away from the river, lest we get dragged away with everything else. "This is more like a hole, if I'm entirely honest," Peter continued. I kneeled down beside my son. This would be his first time crossing the bridge without my help. On each prior cross, he'd been too young, and I'd either carried him on my back or had him wait back at the colony. Now that the colony was gone, and I was too weak to carry him, he'd have to manage on his own. "You ready to do this, Charlie?" I asked. He nodded, as brave as he'd ever been. "Listen, there's bound to be a bunch of empty people stuck in the debris. It's going to be dangerous. These empties are different from the ones we've seen in the city. They'll call out for help. They'll beg and bargain. But don't let that fool you. There's no fear, sadness, nor anger in their voices. There'll be no urgency, even as they lay there, bleeding out. So whatever happens, do not approach them," I said, looking back and forth between Peter and Charlie. They both nodded, confused but diligent. We tied a rope between the three of us. Walking 10 feet apart would ensure that if one of us fell into a pit or sank into the unstable ground, the other two could pull them back up. Charlie, being the lightest, would walk at the back of our small group, while I led the charge. It only took a couple of 100 feet before we saw one of the empty people trapped in a crushed car, emaciated and pale, probably stuck there for the past year, waiting for someone to pass. It pleaded and begged for us to help, asking in the most apathetic voice possible, completely rid of any emotion. "Don't go to the other side without me. I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine," it said. Another one we passed had just impaled itself on a piece of debris, bleeding profusely. Within an hour it would be dead, yet it kept talking as if nothing had happened, its words making sense, but the emotion behind them non-existent. "Hey, take me with you. Please, please, please. It doesn't hurt, I promise. It doesn't hurt. I'll be okay. I'll be okay." Peter looked with concern at the trapped creatures, worried and sorry about his pitiful fate. "Let it be," I ordered. "We can't help them." He complied, and we kept walking. "John, how about you tell me how all of this happened?" Peter asked. I shrugged his curiosity off. It wasn't a memory I wanted to dig into. "We're better off focusing on the rough terrain. We ain't got time to talk," I shot back. "All right, but how about a short summary then?" I sighed, already out of breath from the rough trek across the bridge, ignoring him initially, but he kept prying. He wasn't going to let it go. "They said the storm would pass in the week," I finally uttered about the 10th time he asked. "We did as we were told, held up inside our homes, stocked up on food and water as the worst passed. Only it never did. And after a month of the acidic rain etching away at our once friendly city, buildings started collapsing, sinkholes swallowed the roads, and people died." I sat down on a rock, trying to catch my breath. Talking while wandering was a painful task. And then the people started acting strange. We'd find men, women, and children just wandering through the streets at night, wearing nothing more than their nightgowns to protect them from the pouring rain. They had this look in their eyes, as if they weren't aware enough to care about their surroundings. Sometimes they'd even get hurt. break a leg or cut an artery. Yet they just kept walking aimlessly around, ignoring our pleas to just come back inside. Peter stepped in front of me. "That's what happened to your colony?" he asked. Our colony was formed after the first 6 months. We gathered as many resources as we could, non-perishable foods and water. Since only 1,000 people survived the first 2 evacuations, we figured we'd be fine for a few years at least. But the rain kept pouring. We'd lost contact with the outside world, and anyone brave enough to venture into the dark territory ended up dead. We were trapped, scared, running out of supplies faster than anticipated. You know what happens when there's no system to keep people in place? Peter shook his head. I got back up on my feet, and we kept moving. Well, let's say the empty people weren't the only ones losing their sense of self. As we talked, a small group of empty people started getting close. They'd miraculously navigated across the bridge without getting impaled or hurt by the various debris. They kept mumbling nonsense as they walked past. The only word I could make out was salvation. "Let 'em be," I demanded. Peter kept inquiring about our situation. "So, you've been stuck here for the past 7 years?" he asked. "That's right. 7 years since the storm began in 2020. Peter stopped dead in his tracks, halting our progress. "What the hell do you mean, 2020? "The year. What else?" I asked, confused. "You saying the storm started 7 years ago, in 2020, making the current year 2027? "By my estimation, yeah. It's been a bit hard to keep track, but I'm pretty sure we're somewhere between June and August. Why do you ask?" "John, it's only 2019. I chuckled at the absurd statement. "Listen, Peter, you hit your head pretty hard. It's understandable that you're Look at me, John. I was born in 1995. Do I look like I'm in my mid-30s? He asked. He didn't. He looked like someone in their early 20s, just like I thought when I first found him. Yet, it made no sense. If it truly was that long ago for him, then it meant he'd travelled not only from outside, but from the past. "Do you really think you've travelled through time?" I asked, sounding more condescending than intended. "Well, is that less likely than a storm lasting 7 years? People turning empty and mysterious guardians hindering any escape?" he asked back. Despite my disbelief in his statement, he had a point. "But that means..." I stopped. "That means what, John?" "It means the world is truly gone." "Then how did I get here?" he said, getting more agitated by the minute. I don't know, but the plan stays the same. We keep moving across the bridge. Towards what? Certain death? To be flayed by the guardians like the pile of corpses back at the river? "I don't know," I shouted back, loud enough to attract the attention of the passing empty people, most stuck in debris by then. Peter got quiet. "Do you have a better plan? There's no food left, no water, nothing. You want to go back? We'll die before we find shelter again. So my plan remains. We're following the river, and while we do, we desperately pray to any god you can think of that we somehow managed to find out how the hell you ended up here." He just stared at me. 7 years, Peter. My son grew up not knowing the warmth of the sun, and I'll die before he gets stuck here for the rest of his life. While I frantically yelled in anger, one of the empty people got close enough to grab Charlie. I'd lost focus and just stared at him in complete apathy. For a moment, it didn't matter what happened next. "Help me, help me, help me. Let's stick together, together, together," it begged as it pulled him towards a pit. I just stared. "Dad, help me!" Charlie cried, but I stared on, unable to make myself move. "John, what the hell are you doing?" Peter shouted as he ran over to help Charlie. Finally, I snapped back to reality, immediately pulling my knife out, pushing the creature away from my son while impaling it through its eye. As it fell over dead, Charlie cried for the first time in years, and Peter turned to me with an angry expression on his face. "John, why did you just stand there?" he shouted. I don't know." I rushed over to console Charlie, but he pushed me away. I lost control of myself for a moment. I can't explain it." We didn't have time to discuss it. Darkness loomed over us as nightfall approached. After catching our breaths once more, we rushed the last few 100 feet across. We desperately needed to find shelter before another blizzard set in. No sooner had we set foot on the edge of the bridge before a brilliantly bright light appeared on the horizon. It was unlike anything I'd seen since the beginning of the storm, appearing as blue sun lighting up everything around us. The light looked cold as ice, yet it warmed us more than anything had for the past 7 years. The river stretched all the way towards the light, and I knew in my heart that Peter had somehow come through it. "Is that the sun?" Charlie asked hopefully. "No, that's something else entirely," I responded, baffled by the magnificent sight. "How far away is it?" Peter asked. I tried to the best of my ability to judge the distance, but the shine of the light made it hard to get a clear view. If it lay by just one of the bodies of water making up the river, it would be another day's trek, meaning we'd have to venture through the dark territory. "I'm guessing another day and a half's walk," I finally said. They both seemed hopeful. The train itself wasn't as rough as the rest of the trip, but I was beginning to realize I might not make it that far. "In any case, we'll need to find shelter. We're not traversing the dark territory at night." We searched for an hour before finally finding a partially collapsed warehouse. Not a great cover for the oncoming blizzard, but it was the best we could do in the outskirts of town. I lit a fire for the night and shared the last can of beans. "I'm sorry about earlier," I said to Charlie. "It's okay," Charlie said, half asleep. "Can you tell me a story?" That night, as Charlie fell asleep, for the first time, I told him a story about the future and not the past. "I love you. Be good, kid," I told him after he'd drifted off. I remained awake, staring into the embers as the blizzard raged outside. My mind wandered. I tried to keep it focused, but to no avail. I saw images of my wife, memories of digging sandcastles on the beach with Charlie, flashes of wine and dances, the past of a better life. I was tired, worn down to the bone, hollowed out by the rain like so many people before me. In a matter of hours, my mind would be lost, and my son would be left alone, fending for himself with someone who clearly didn't belong. Without waking the other two, I sat down to write the final part of my journal. I've kept track of most events during the past 7 years, but I feel like the last few days are the most important. I'm leaving this to you, Peter. When you find me empty in the morning, I need you to take Charlie with you across the dark territory. Bring him to the light and cross over to a better world. You might even have the chance to stop this all from happening. And Charlie, I love you. Be good and live a happier life in the sun. I wish I could be there with you until the end, but my time's up. You deserve so much more than this world has given you, and now you might finally have it. Good luck to you both. John. I woke in the early hours of the following morning. Charlie was frantically calling out for his father. John had left his bed and seemingly vanished, leaving his journal neatly placed by my bedside. We searched the warehouse before I even checked what John had written, but he wasn't inside. I picked up the journal and opened it. I only needed to read the first few lines to realize what had happened. John had turned empty and left instructions to me, telling me to save Charlie. "Dad," Charlie yelled as he stormed out the door, back into the rain. John was standing motionless outside, staring towards the horizon. He didn't even react to Charlie's plea for attention. "Dad, what are you doing?" he continued, on the verge of tears. He walked towards John, though whatever John had been just the day before had been washed away by the heavy rainfall. "Charlie, stay away from John," I yelled as I ran over to grab him. "Let me go," he said as he tried to wriggle himself loose from my grip. "Dad," he cried. John hadn't moved, not even acknowledging our presence. "No," he kept screaming as I pulled him back inside the warehouse and shut the door. He was incredibly strong for a 10-year-old, but I kept him at bay while he cried and punched me. "He's gone, Charlie. John is gone." "No, he isn't. He can't be. He promised." He continued sobbing incomprehensibly. I held him tight and let him cry it out, and he eventually stopped resisting my grip. The one person in his life had been taken away for no reason other than bad luck. Simply wasted away in a world where humanity had become little more than a faint memory. Charlie sat by the fire, reading John's journal. He silently sobbed as he turned the pages. He'd learned to read from his father, and he'd written the journal as a reminder of what they'd gone through, in hopes that one day someone would save them. "I'm sorry about your dad, Charlie." He didn't respond. I packed what little things we had into John's bag. We had to keep walking while we still had the energy. Without food nor water, this would be our last day whether we found salvation or not. When we finally got back outside, John had wandered off. I had the thought of killing what remained of him in the back of my head, to free him like he'd taught me, but now I wouldn't get the chance. "Thanks for saving me, John. You were a good man," I mumbled to myself. The light shone bright on the horizon, reflecting off the millions of raindrops, appearing as endless beams shooting through the air. Despite the cold, blue color, it made me feel warm to once again wander through light, to once again see the landscape in front of me. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked Charlie. He looked at me for a brief moment and shook his head. The river got wider as we proceeded. In the distance, something that looked like a wall appeared, spanning endlessly in each direction around the city. "What's that wall?" I asked. "It's the flesh. That's where the dark territory begins," he responded quietly. Faint clicking sounds could be heard in the distance, distorted echoes coming from whatever lurked in the rain. A few empty people wandered alongside us on our journey, too many to kill, and they seemed oblivious to our company. They had come from all directions, but each were pulled towards the light. On the road, several emaciated figures lay motionless. They had become too weak to move, and only their blinking eyes proved that they were still alive. When we got close enough to see the wall, I could make out figures, limbs, viscera and torn flesh that made out the majority of the wall. Charlie barely acknowledged the horror before us, unafraid and apathetic to it. If he was just a brave kid, or on the brink of turning empty, I couldn't tell. Some empties were attempting to climb the wall, but its slippery surface caused them to slip back and sink into the meat-filled mass. The only opening was by the river. Piles of dead people littered the water, but the wall wasn't as thick around it. We could pass easily enough. As we walked around the riverside, the clicking got louder. It was rhythmic and split up into intervals, though I couldn't exactly determine its origin. It came from several directions, as if something was communicating. On the other side of the wall, we were faced with a new type of nightmare. The entire land had turned into an impossible fleshscape, with what appeared as muscles, tendons, and blood vessels covering every inch of its surface. A single empty person made it above the wall and wandered across the flesh. Tendrils entangled in vessels reached out from the ground and grabbed onto the empty, pulling them down to the ground, slowly consuming and merging them with itself. "How are we going to get through here?" I asked. Charlie didn't respond. He simply climbed down from the wall, wielding his knife. A few tendrils grew from the ground, wrapped in veins, but Charlie slashed at them with his knife, causing blood to spurt out briefly before it fell to the ground. "Charlie, what are you doing?" "They can't get us if we keep moving," he said. "You've been here before?" I asked. "One time." I climbed down onto the flesh-covered surface. It felt warm to the touch, gently bouncing my feet with each step. A tendril reached for me, and I slashed it off with ease. It was slow for sure, and as long as we kept wandering, we'd seemingly be safe. The light was still a few hours away, but it had grown to a tremendous size, a brilliant blue globe lighting our path to salvation. We kept close to the river. If John had been right, we simply needed to follow it all the way to the light. Every now and then, a body, limb, or viscera was pulled from the fleshscape and floated downstream towards the city. The clicking was getting closer, but I was just starting to realize that it didn't come from any direction in the distance. It was coming from underground. That's the first time I noticed how the ground twitched and contracted in response to our steps. It hadn't occurred in the early stages of the dark territory, but now it had become impossible to ignore. "Charlie, hold up." "What?" We both stopped walking, but the twitching continued, going from minor ticks to violent spastic contractions. Some muscle fibers in the ground opened up beneath our feet, and we pulled away towards the river. "Watch out," I yelled. "What's happening?" he asked back. A tall figure dug itself up from the ground, towering 15 feet tall, 2 legs and a torso, but without arms or a head. Its skin seemed char black, vesicles covering the majority of its surface. It emitted the clicking sound we'd heard, calling out for the tendrils, which emerged from the ground in response. It held onto the ground with its legs, claws sticking out from all sides of the stumpy appendage. "Run!" I ordered. I grabbed Charlie and headed straight for the river. It was the only place where I could think to hide, and since the flesh didn't grow much in the water, I hoped it couldn't sense us there. The creature wandered across the meat-covered land, turning its charred torso around while searching for whatever had awoken it, looking for us. Beneath the pitch-black skin of the creature, a couple of lids tore apart, revealing a single, completely white eye with a minuscule pupil darting rapidly around its socket. We lowered ourselves into the water, hoping the creature wouldn't notice us. As long as we didn't touch the flesh, hopefully it couldn't sense us. "What the hell is that thing?" I whispered. "It's a guardian." The commotion had attracted a couple of empty people, both relatively unharmed even on the fleshscape. The ground twitched beneath their feet as they approached the creature. It observed them for a brief moment before grabbing one of them with a foot, and in a single, swift movement, it tore the empty person in half. Its leg then started expanding, and its flesh wrapped around the half it still held onto. Within a second, the skin had been seared off by acid seeping out through the bursting vesicles of the creature's skin, after which it dumped the flayed person to the ground, letting the flesh fuse together. After less than a minute, both empties had been flayed and consumed, and the creature seemed content, but the original disturbance caused by us still lingered on its mind. It kept searching while we hid in the river, We must have hung on to the edge of the river for an hour while the creature surged. All the while its eye remained open, unblinking, desperately looking for intruders. After a while, the clicking stopped, and the tendril sunk back into the ground. After the last tendril disappeared, the guardian closed its eye and simply started sinking back into the ground, leaving the surface monotonous and empty once more. Relieved, I let out a sigh. The river, despite its strong currents, would be our safest option proceeding ahead. All right, we better keep moving, but we can't walk on land anymore. Those things can sense our touch. Charlie nodded, shivering from the freezing water, but while the fleshscape stretched endlessly far, impossible to traverse, the light itself was close, within reach. If we kept moving, we'd be there in an hour. I dug out a rope from my backpack and tied it between myself and Charlie. The water wasn't particularly deep near the edge, but sudden surges in the current could easily sweep one of us away, especially a small, malnourished kid like Charlie. "I'm really cold," he said. "We're almost there, Charlie. Can you hang on for just a bit longer?" "I'll try." We walked in the knee-deep freezing water, trying our best to avoid small flesh appendages that had grown into the side of the river. Any touch would alert the guardians, and if they saw us, we wouldn't stand a chance. "Just a bit further. We're almost there," I said. Charlie started slowing down. As skinny as he was, on the brink of starvation, he simply couldn't retain much heat. "I'm tired," he said. "Don't give up, Charlie," I begged. I felt him tug on the rope behind me. He'd almost come to a complete standstill. Without any further option, I lifted him up and put him on my back. Oh, we were so close. The light shone brighter than ever before, and it warmed me up to the point where I barely felt the freezing temperature of the water anymore. Why didn't it work for Charlie? "Charlie, we're almost there." He didn't respond. He'd fallen unconscious from the cold and exhaustion. "Charlie." I upped my pace, but the current had gotten stronger, and the end of the river finally met us. What lay before us was a massive lake, covered by a thin layer of what seemed like human skin, stretched so thin it had become partially transparent. The blue light hung a few feet in the air on the other side of the lake, appearing as a massive globe of ice. "Charlie, do you see that? We're almost home." He didn't respond. We had to tread back onto land to get around the lake. If not, we'd end up enveloped in the mesh of skin covering the waters. Only a few 100 yards to safety. I stepped onto the riverbank, and the ground immediately twitched in reaction. I took another step, causing a tendril to emerge from the ground and reach for me. It was much thicker than the ones we'd faced before, and I only had one hand free while trying to keep Charlie on my back. I swung with all my force and cut through it. The ground shook as the muscles moved apart, leaving a large gash in the ground from where the guardians could emerge. 3 pulled themselves up through the flesh and gave chase after us. They were tall, much larger than before, but to our advantage, they were also slower. Even with Charlie on my back, I could outrun them, but not for long. Several tendrils extended from the ground, not trying to grab myself, but going directly for Charlie. A few clung on, and I swung at them, severing a few. On my second swing, one grabbed the shaft of my knife, cutting into itself, but causing me to let go of it. "Hang on, Charlie," I yelled as I ran, my lungs almost bursting from the effort. The guardians seemed bizarrely slow, quickly giving up on the chase as we got closer to the light. I peeked back at them, and they seemed almost frozen, as if covered in ice, emerging from the blue light. Despite the guardians struggling, the tendrils kept growing in number and size, grasping for us as we spurted over the fleshscape. Charlie started coming to as we got closer to the glowing globe. He moaned quietly in agony. "The light, it hurts," he cried out as we got closer. It was horribly bright, almost blinding, yet nothing could compare to its beauty. Its magnificent contrast to its horrible surroundings. Whatever pain it caused Charlie, it was better than staying behind to be flayed by the monsters. One of the tendrils caught my leg, causing me to stumble to the ground and dropping Charlie. Another grabbed him where he lay on the ground. I kicked and tore at its flesh. And finally, it let me go, but it had grabbed Charlie around his neck, choking away the little life he had left. Even with all my force, I couldn't tear it away, and as a last resort, I simply bit it. A metallic taste filled my mouth as blood spurted from the twisted appendage. I spit it out and lifted Charlie off the ground. My muscles burned and my joints ached, but I kept moving, dragging my beaten body across the ground. I got a bit further before collapsing. The light hung just a few feet above us, but I couldn't bring myself back on my feet. I reached out my hand, trying to grab the light, and suddenly I felt the ground give in beneath me. We were being lifted up towards it. "We made it, Charlie," I said, on the brink of passing out. The blue light started enveloping us. All the pain and fear that had filled my body started to vanish. I looked around for Charlie. I'd held onto his hand, but I couldn't see him anymore. "Charlie!" The last thing I heard was a scream of agony coming from Charlie. He was falling back through the light towards the flesh gate. I frantically tried to grab onto him, but the light was too bright. I couldn't see, I couldn't hear, nor feel at all anymore. It was as if the world had been erased, and myself with it. And then I fell. Even now I can't tell how far I fell. It could have been a few feet, it could have been miles. All I remember is hitting the ground hard, breaking as I landed in a different world. I lay motionless, unable to breathe. As my vision returned, I saw a brilliant blue sky, cloudless, only decorated with our yellow, majestic sun. I laughed. I was back. I was safe. After an horrific ordeal, I could finally rest. With that, I let myself pass out. They found me lying in the middle of a football field. 2 broken legs, a few ribs, and multiple vertebrae. Bruises, torn ligaments, and a punctured lung. I'd been beaten up quite badly by the fall, but despite it all, I'd survived. "Charlie, we made it," were my first words as I awoke a couple of days later in the hospital. "Who's Charlie?" the doctor asked as he checked my vitals. "The kid I came through the portal with. Where is he? Where's Charlie?" The doctor laughed. "Your name is Peter Matthews, correct?" I nodded my head, pain radiating down my spine. I asked him again about Charlie, mumbled something about the portal, and asked if the rain had come yet. I was high on pain medication, so the doctor initially shrugged off my weird questions. Charlie never came with me through the portal. I remember his screams of agony, letting go of his hand. It dawned on me that he'd stayed behind, left to suffer in the rain. They'd found me alone. A witness said I simply appeared in the middle of the field. According to my injuries, they believed I'd fallen quite a distance, but from where they couldn't tell. At the moment of writing this, I'm still cooped up at the hospital. I've tried searching for John and Charlie online, but without their last names, it's a futile task. Not to mention that Greenville is an extremely generic town's name. I owe both of them my life, and in return, I ended up losing them. So, I'm writing this in their honor. They gave me a second chance at life, returned me to my own life. Though, if the storm truly begins in 2020, we may not have that much time left. John, if you read this, if you believe my story, get out of Greenville. Save your family while there's still time. Well, another brilliant story there from Richard Saxon. Absolutely knocking it out of the park yet again. I just simply do not know where he comes up with this stuff. Consistently brilliant with every single story. Definitely one of my favourite authors, and I'm delighted that he shared that one with me as well. Well, another long one. Can I keep this up? I will certainly do my best. On a bit of a roll now. Well, I'm in the Netherlands, as long-term listeners will know, and I've got a bit of downtime, quite a lot of downtime at the moment, so I am finding quite a lot of time to record stories, even though I've moved from one country to another. So I hope you're enjoying this. Well, definitely enough from me for one evening, but I will be back again very soon, and I do so hope you'll join me. Until then, sweet dreams and bye-bye. Thank you so much for choosing to spend your time listening to me. Now, if you enjoyed the Dr. Creepen experience, then come find me on Facebook. Come chat with me on Twitter. Listen to the background music and download it if you like on SoundCloud. Drop by the store, pick up a t-shirt. And, importantly, if you've got a story you'd like me to read, send it to Dr. Creepen's Vault, the subreddit I set up so that I could read your stories. Now, looking forward to seeing you all again real soon. So, come check me out, okay?
The Undead Age, Origin Stories, an Undead Age novella, written by A.M. Geever, narrated by Jeannie Marshall. Father Walter Brennan, Monday, September 14th, 2026, Santa Clara, California. Father Walter Brennan surveyed his dreary office through narrowed eyes. No amount of sprucing up could hide the fact that the Department of Mathematics and Computer Science at Santa Clara University was in a basement. At least my new office has a window, he thought, even if it was one of those long, narrow, almost near the ceiling kinds of a window. Sunlight still streamed through it, unlike his first office at the university in Galway, Ireland, not far from where he had grown up. That windowless hovel had felt like a dungeon. Walter checked his watch, 7:45 a.m. Enough time for a cup of tea, he thought, his mind already jumping ahead to his lecture. He reached for his keys, but froze mid-motion. Shouting, then a strangled scream from the hallway. What on earth? He thought, hurrying to the door. Walter would never forget the sight that awaited him. Allison Landry, advanced calculus, and Sebastian Nichols, automata theory and formal languages, sprawled on the floor at the bottom of the stairs that led down to the basement from the building's south entrance. A slight woman in her early 60s, Allison had knocked the younger and stronger Sebastian to the ground. She was ripping Sebastian's throat out with her teeth. Bright red blood spurted in high, thin arcs before spattering on the worn linoleum. Sebastian's strangled gurgles, punctuated by Allison's animal-like grunts, sent cold shivers up Walter's spine. Sebastian flailed without effect against his attacker. For a moment, shock rooted Walter right where he stood. Holy Mother of God. Walter dashed toward them and grabbed one of Allison's arms. Allison turned and lunged at him, Sebastian's blood dripping from her chin, then abruptly jerked back. A very tall, slender young man had grabbed Allison's other arm, a visiting assistant professor, but from a different department. Walter had met him, but couldn't remember his name. He was so slender he looked like he would blow over in a breeze, but he held Allison fast. Allison snapped and snarled between them like a rabid dog. "What the hell is wrong with her?" the visiting assistant professor asked. Walter couldn't answer. He didn't know how to process what he was seeing, nor interpret it. "Get something to tie her up," visiting assistant professor shouted. No one heard him above the din of people streaming into the narrow corridor that ran the length of the building. Allison thrashed like a wild animal. Despite her wasted appearance, Walter could barely keep hold on her arm. Her strength was simply unbelievable. They had to get her restrained before she hurt anyone else. Walter looked around for something that might work when he spied an extension cord hanging on the corner of an AV cart just a few feet away. "I'm going to grab that card from the cart," Walter said. "I'll only be able to keep one hand on her arm. Hold tight." Visiting assistant professor nodded. His fine, sandy-colored hair fell into his eyes before he tossed his head to clear his line of vision. Walter reached for the cord. He almost lost his grip on Allison's arm, but visiting assistant professor proved loads stronger than he looked. Together, they tied Allison to a chair. Walter turned to see John Seschla, the department chair, trying to staunch the wound on Sebastian's neck with a gym towel. Sebastian had become very still. Walter could see he was not breathing. "I think he's gone. Why don't you let me take over?" "The ambulance will be here soon, Walter. They can help him." "I'll just say a prayer then." Walter knelt beside Sebastian's body. He felt wetness against his knee. Dear God, he had knelt down in Sebastian's blood. He didn't have any oil and could not remember if Sebastian was practicing anything despite having known him for over 5 years. He decided it didn't matter. He traced a small cross on Sebastian's forehead with his thumb. "Through this holy anointing, may the Lord in his love and mercy help you with the grace of the Holy Spirit. May the Lord who frees you from sin save you and raise you up." Hearing Walter say the last rites seemed to get through to John better than trying to reason with him. He let go of the towel on Sebastian's neck. "What the hell is this, Walter?" Walter shook his head. "I don't know." He was about to ask if anyone had called 911 when he saw almost every student in the hallway filming the unfolding horror show on their cell phones. Walter covered more ground in 3 steps than he ever thought possible and snatched the phone out of the nearest boy's hand. "Hey!" the kid protested. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Walter snapped at the students, his brogue stronger in his anger. He pointed to the north entrance at the other end of the building. "Get out of here! Now!" The wail of approaching sirens signaled help was on the way. Walter turned back to his homicidal colleague, who growled and thrashed against the cord that held her fast. The blood on her face had started to dry, flaking away where the smears were thin. Blood still coated her teeth, as if she had no saliva to dilute it. "Allison," he said, "why did you do this?" No answer, just growls and moans. "I met her last week. She complained she was coming down with a cold, but she looked fine at the new faculty reception yesterday. Now she looks like death warmed over," visiting assistant professor said. Walter had seen Allison the day before as well. The transformation, sunken eyes with dark circles, shriveled and chapped lips, the reek of decay, was astonishing. "She looks like she's lost 20 pounds overnight," Walter said, "and her eyes, it's like she's not even there." The doors behind them burst open. Campus security pounded down the stairs, followed by paramedics who knelt beside Sebastian's prone form. A dark-haired woman paramedic checked his pulse, then shook her head. "He's gone." The campus security officers gaped at Allison and the bloody body at their feet. One of them shook himself, seeming to remember that he should be taking charge. Who can tell me what happened here?" "I suppose I can," Walter said when no one else answered. "I heard shouting in the hallway." "Hey! He's moving!" The officer turned back. Walter stepped forward. Sebastian twitched. The woman paramedic put her hand to Sebastian's bloody, ruined neck. "I don't have a pulse." "The guy's moving," the other paramedic said, not looking up from the IV he had started prepping. "Get a dressing on his neck." "There's no pulse," the first paramedic insisted. Her partner reached over to check for himself. Sebastian's eyes opened. Then he turned his head toward the man's extended hand and bit him. "Get him off me!" The woman paramedic scrambled to assist her partner. The campus security officer rushed into the fray. Sebastian's arms and legs were moving. He let go of the screaming paramedic's hand, and the man scurried backwards. Then Sebastian grabbed the woman paramedic's arm and bit her too. Things seemed to happen in slow motion and fast forward all at once after that. Walter watched as more campus security streamed through the doors behind Sebastian and the paramedics, bottlenecking on the stairs. Sebastian had already attacked the first officer, but not before the man tased him in the chest. Sebastian never slowed down. He smashed the poor man's head against the wall with a sickening crack before beginning to gnaw on him. Bodies pressed against Walter as people tried to get away, their screams and shouts echoing off the walls. He was pushed into the AV cart and lost his footing as it rolled from the force of the impact. Walter stumbled, trying to right himself. People were panicked. He would be trampled if he fell. He extended his arm, and when his hand hit the floor, he pushed hard. Regaining his footing, he got clear of the AV cart, which bounced like a pinball against the fleeing onlookers. He heard more screams behind him and looked back. Someone had gotten too close to Allison, who was still tied to the chair. The pandemonium intensified as Santa Clara police entered the building from the other end of the corridor, blocking the only escape route. And still Sebastian lurched down the hall. Walter felt two strong hands grab his shoulders. He cried out in panic and struggled against them, but was pulled backward into darkness. A heavy door slammed shut with a metallic thud. Walter heard a sliding lock shoved into place. "Help me push against the door," visiting assistant professor said, his voice barely a whisper. Struggling to tamp down his panic, Walter realized he was in the building's tiny maintenance room. Feeble light trickled in from a tiny glass block window near the ceiling. He could barely make out a drum of cleaning solvent against the wall. Walter pulled while visiting assistant professor pushed. As his eyes adjusted to the poor light, Walter saw 3 more people crammed in with them against the back wall. The chaos on the other side of the door intensified. Gunfire and screams reverberated down the hallway. More sirens wailed, some distant, some near. Walter and the rest of the occupants of the tiny room huddled together as far away from the door as possible. "Do you think we'll be safe in here?" a young woman's voice asked. Visiting assistant professor said, "It's better than the hallway." "There's no way out but the door," she said, not quite disagreeing. "We're trapped." "I think we're safer in here," Walter said. Under his breath, he muttered, "Please God, let help be here soon." As soon as the words left his mouth, Walter realized that the police and campus security were already here, and he felt safer in this closet. A man's voice, high with fright. "The guy from campus security tasered him, and he didn't even slow down." No one had anything to say after that. They fell silent, listening to the screams and shouts and gunfire. Sirens seemed to be coming from every direction. Dark shadows flickered across the cracks of light around the door. The astringent smell of cleaning fluid and furniture polish permeated the stuffy air. Walter looked up at visiting assistant professor. "You saved my life, and I don't even know your name." A ghost of a smile lifted the corners of visiting assistant professor's mouth. Walter could not tell the color of his eyes, but the tiny expression transformed the young man's delicate features into movie star handsomeness. He stuck out his hand. "Doug Michelle, Astrophysics, Florida State. I'm here to work with... I can't even remember." "I'm Walter Brennan," Walter said before adding inanely, "I teach algebra and statistics." "What the hell do you get up to here in math and CS, Walter?" Doug whispered. "I'm not complaining. But why is there a lock on the inside of this door?" Walter looked at the lock, then back to Doug. "I'm sure I don't want to know." Connor McGuire. Tuesday, September 15th, 2026. Guasapa, El Salvador. Connor spread his fingers apart between the slats of the blinds and looked at the street below. The streetlights cast no illumination, nor would they. The bulbs that helped the creatures see had been smashed, if they could see. No one was sure about that. They could definitely hear. That had been obvious from the start, by the way their heads tilted as they tried to locate their prey, and from the moans that began at one end of a mass of them, rippling across the wretched assemblies until the moans and hisses and snapping teeth stretched from one end to the other. Dark forms darted from spot to spot on the street. A bus stop shelter, a portico, a pickup truck. Before the sun set, he'd seen other variations. People frozen in place, a tense stillness so complete that they were sometimes overlooked by the ravenous creatures. He could almost see the frantic energy coiling below the surface of their skin that exploded when they thought they could make a break for safety. It didn't work every time, but once was enough to perhaps get that person to the next time, when they might get lucky again. "Agua, por favor," a weak voice whispered. Connor stepped back from the window, a quieting finger to his lips. He needn't have bothered. Sor Juana's voice was far too weak to travel beyond the walls of the small room, but the lesson of quiet and stealth, so newly learned, demanded compliance. If noise meant death, silence meant not life, but the possibility of it. He let the blanket that covered the window fall back into place. He skirted the table and crossed to the old nun, lighting the candle on the bedside table, before holding a glass of water to her lips. She seemed to weaken from minute to minute now, unable to lift her head when just an hour ago she had been sitting upright. Her face flushed red, but her papery skin felt cool under his fingers, and her teeth chattered. Connor had seen others stuff the mouths of the sick with cloth to mask the sound of clacking enamel, but could not bring himself to do so. Sor Juana was so frail, so diminished by the infection that ravaged her body. Gagging her would be an act of violence he couldn't bring himself to inflict upon her. The rest of the tiny clinic at the back of the monastery was empty. Everyone else had fled. Connor didn't blame them. If he hadn't promised Brother Tomas that he would look after Sor Juana until he returned, Connor would have joined them. The illness and chaos that had ravaged San Salvador was repeating itself in this hamlet outside of Guasapa. Brother Tomas was hours overdue, which probably meant he wasn't coming back. But Connor had given his word and would keep it. Over the past week, he had seen almost everyone he knew break the promises they had made in good faith in order to survive. He would keep this last one before he began to break his promises, too. Maybe she'll be different, he thought. He hoped, he prayed. But he knew she wouldn't be. Miracles were more scarce than ever. Sor Juana would end up like the rest. The knowledge that an end to her suffering meant that the old nun would not slow him down when he finally left filled Connor with a shame equal to his relief. Preemptive penance, another reason he stayed. He blew out the candle and sat on the floor at the foot of the bed, holding a ragged pillow in his lap. It would not be long now. Connor jerked awake. The lack of light was so complete that he couldn't see the hand he raised to his face to reassure himself that he hadn't gone blind. What the hell had woken him? Because something had yanked him from his accidental slumber, but he didn't hear anything that might have been the culprit. An electric current of fear shot through his body. The silence had woken him. He could not hear Sor Juana's labored breathing or chattering teeth. He waited, hoping that the silence might be one of the long, uneven pauses between breaths common to those balancing on the precipice between life and death. He strained to hear a ragged breath or a delicate wheeze. He only needed one to give him time to smother her with the pillow still clutched in his hands. Nothing but silence. Then the rancid aroma of loosened bowels. She had died just now. He had missed his opportunity to release the old woman with no danger to himself by seconds. He leaned forward, reaching for the handle of the pointy carpenter's rasp tucked inside his back pocket. The worn handle, smoothed and polished by decades of oil and sweat, slipped into his palm with a velvety softness. The bed springs creaked, followed by a hiss like a leaking bicycle tire. The window overlooking the street was directly opposite where Connor sat. If he pulled down the blanket that covered it, there would be enough moonlight to help him see, to enable him to perform the terrible epilogue to his promise. He vaulted into the darkness. A snarling grunt followed him, and a hand closed around his ankle. Connor fell to the floor, the metallic rattle of the rasp skittering away, filling his ears. He lurched onto his hands and knees, thrashing his captured leg like a donkey giving a hind leg kick. The grip on his ankle loosened, and he shook himself free, scrambling to his feet. 2 steps later, he slammed into the table. In his haste, he'd forgotten about it. Sor Juana's high-pitched moan filled the room. She rammed into his back, a warhammer wielded by an angry god. He fell over the table, all the air expelled from his lungs. A snap of teeth caught the sleeve of his shirt, missing his arm by a hair's breadth. The fabric ripped as Connor reared back and twisted around, choking, unable to suck enough air into his lungs. He pushed her off and rounded the corner of the table, not turning his back on her. The impact as she collided with him again traveled up his right arm. He stumbled backward against the window, the clatter of the falling blinds deafening as they fell to the floor. The blanket that had covered the blinds fluttered down, snaring them both. The stench of rotting meat hit him like a punch to the face. Connor twisted his head to the side, constrained by the blanket covering them both, the snap of teeth beside his ear impossibly loud. He pushed against the old nun and rolled, the blanket flapping around them, and a sudden memory of playing blob with his cousins surfaced. The game consisted of sitting along the inside edge of a blanket on the floor, holding onto it with one hand. At the count of 3, they all yelled, "Blob!" and rolled into the center, wrapping the blanket around themselves as they bumped into one another, laughing and giggling. Then they had smoothed out the blanket to do it again. Connor flailed against the blanket, the strings of the blinds, the old nun, the darkness enveloping him in this deadly version of blob, even as the childish laughter of his cousins echoed in his head. His hand slipped beyond the blanket's edge. He clutched it and freed his head, then pulled the blanket over Sor Juana's face. Her snapping teeth scraped against his cheek, but the blanket blunted their deadly purpose. Weak moonlight shone through the window, throwing the room into the sharp relief of gray and black. Connor tightened the blanket around Sor Juana's neck. He searched the room. The end of the rasp handle poked into the moonlight from a shadow a few feet away. He slid over on his ass, dragging the thrashing woman with him. He picked up the rasp, then felt the front of her face through the blanket to locate her eyes. "God bless you, sister," he whispered. Connor jammed the rasp into her eye through the blanket. The textured metal rod punctured the eye socket and slid into her brain. Sor Juana slumped, her body dead weight against him. He pushed her away and sat for a moment, catching his breath. Outside, the moans of the creatures in the street grew louder. Staying on his knees, he peeked over the windowsill. The commotion had attracted their attention. 40 or so stood below the window, moaning. More were coming down the street and from nearby alleys, stumbling like drunkards in the moonlight. Connor climbed to his feet and found his pack. He checked the contents one last time. Water, some food, leather gloves, an extra flannel shirt, 3 pairs of socks, the CD he had found, and the tool set. The pistol given to Brother Tomas by a man with unsavory connections, who was rumored to be a sicario, was there too. He wrapped the CD in the extra shirt. God only knew when he could listen to it, but if he ever did, he wanted Miranda to be with him. "I just want the chance to tell her that I know I fucked up." He pushed the mistakes he'd made with Miranda aside. He couldn't do anything about it now. He had to stay alive if he ever wanted to make things right, so he had to focus on the here and now. He refastened the Rolex watch that a reporter from home had traded for his car. It had come loose in the scuffle with Sor Juana. Connor would have given the reporter the car. He knew where he could get a motorcycle, and he wanted something that he knew how to fix, since he had no idea how far he needed to travel to reach safety. But he'd accepted the trade when the reporter offered. He might be able to trade such an expensive watch for something he needed later on. It wasn't as bad in the States yet, the reporter had told him. Connor clung to the hope that the reporter was still right. He tucked the rasp and the gun into the waistband of his jeans, then glanced out the window. The number of creatures in the street had tripled. He would exit at the other end of the building, on the far end of the block, where he hoped less of them congregated. Connor shrugged into his jacket, then the backpack. He stepped into the hallway, resisting the urge to look back at poor Sor Juana, and fled, like all the others. Emily McGuire. Wednesday, September 16th, 2026, Los Altos, California. Emily pushed the sleek glass door open, squinting as the bright afternoon sun assaulted her eyes. Superheated air, dry and hot, radiated up from the black concrete sidewalk. She dug into the debris field that doubled as her purse as she stalked across the parking lot of Sonalto's cookie-cutter tech company campus. Her platform sandals clicked against the pavement. What a bunch of pretentious assholes, she thought. She yanked her keys free of a tangled charging cord and jammed her sunglasses over her nose. Where did I park? Angered by the interview, she'd walked out of the building blindly. She started clicking the unlock button on the car's ignition dongle on the same key ring with her house, garage, and bicycle lock keys, heard a bleep, and realized she had passed it. Once inside, she turned on the air conditioning and reached for her phone, then backed out of the parking spot. The hands-free speaker picked up as the line began to ring. Almost immediately, the call went to voicemail. This is Miranda, and you almost reached me. Leave me a message and I'll return your call. Maybe. You were right, Mary. High Tech is a boys' club, and the interview was a total waste of time. The guys interviewing me, all guys, were such dicks. They kept talking about disrupting the market space, like they were so clever they could reinvent the wheel or something. At the end, they asked me one of those stupid brain teasers questions like people said Google used to do. I was so fed up. I told them it had nothing to do with being a marketing intern and that they only asked it to feel superior by making people squirm when they couldn't figure it out. She chuffed out a laugh. You should have seen their faces. Emily pushed harder on the gas pedal. The shiny smoked glass and steel building, the pretentious organic mini orchard of orange and lemon trees on both sides of the winding main drive of Sonalto's corporate campus. She couldn't get away from the place fast enough. Why did I ever think I wanted to work at an agri-tech company anyway? She thought. 3 short beeps pinged through the car's speakers. My phone's almost dead, Mary. I hope your day's going better than mine. Talk to you later. Emily pushed the end call button on the steering wheel, then pulled at the charging cord for her phone, glancing away to plug it in. When she looked back up, a man staggered from the fruit trees into the path of her car, his hand upraised as if he were hailing a cab. She slammed on the brakes and saw his eyes go wide as he realized she couldn't stop in time. The thud as her car and his body collided made her stomach turn somersaults. She fumbled with the button on the seatbelt. First her hands, then her entire body started to shake. She scrambled out of the car on unsteady legs. Oh, please don't be dead. Jesus, please don't be dead, she pleaded as she ran to the crumpled figure. The man had landed yards away from where she had struck him. He moaned and stirred as she knelt beside him. Oh, thank God, Emily said, relieved that he was alive, before taking in his awkward landing and ripped shirt. Blood from a gash on his temple coursed over his face. Shit. Emily dropped her keys and pulled off her suit jacket, stuffing it under the man's bloody head. His light brown eyes came into focus. He raised his arm. No, don't get up, Emily cried, catching his arm. The man pulled free and pointed in the direction he had come from. He whispered something, but she couldn't hear what he said. I'll call an ambulance, she said, realizing that her phone was still in the car. Don't get up, I'll be right back. She started to stand, but the man grabbed her wrist. The strength of his grip startled her. Then he let go and pointed. His voice was weak, but urgent. Run! Confused, Emily followed the line of his pointing arm. There were people walking through the little fruit tree orchard, a lot of them. They stumbled and shuffled, many obviously limped. They bumped into one another without acknowledgement. It was odd. Why were they walking on a private corporate campus at least a mile from a pedestrian walkway? Help! Emily shouted as she jumped to her feet, shoving the strangeness of the people aside, because she needed help. A woman walked out from the leafy fruit trees. Her floral print dress was ripped at the shoulder and stained with something dark and brown. She wore one shiny red pump so that the gait of her stride alternated, up, down, up, down. Her skin looked gray and leathery. What the hell? Emily thought, taking a step back. Then another person and another neared the edge of the orchard. They too were injured and blood-soaked and looked sick. But worst of all was when they started to moan. Emily's skin began to crawl as the most unnatural sound she had ever heard filled the air. But the moaning wasn't just in front of her. She turned around to discover more people nearing the tree line on the other side of the drive. Fear shot through her body, sudden and electric. Emily looked at the man, desperation filling her chest. He was unconscious, maybe dead, and outweighed her by 100 pounds, but she couldn't leave him. She slid her hands under his shoulders, gripped him under his arms, and pulled. He barely budged. She looked back up at the moaning, bloody people beginning to stumble out of the trees. They didn't seem to move very fast, but were closing the distance. Emily pulled again, every muscle in her body quivering with effort, but she hadn't moved him an inch. She looked at the man. He had told her to run. "My phone is in the car. I'll call the police." She sprinted for her car, jumped inside, slammed the door shut, and fumbled for her phone, panic making her fingers feel like jelly. One by one, people staggered out from the trees. 911 picked up on the first ring.
"All circuits are busy. Please try your call again. All circuits..."
Fuck! She'd drive back to Sinalto. People were there, normal people, and they could call 911. They could help her. She jammed in the clutch and stabbed at the start button. Nothing happened. She looked to the center console, but her keys weren't there. Frantic now, she searched the passenger seat and the floor. She cast a desperate look out the windshield to see how close the people were. Oh my God, no! They were attacking the man she had hit, snarling and biting, falling on him like wild animals. And then she saw her keys, glittering in the sun while blood pooled around them and the car's ignition dongle. She had dropped them when she took off her jacket. The staggering, moaning nightmare of people from the trees who had not stopped to attack the man were almost to the car. She started to pull the door shut when a sudden clarity descended on her. If she stayed in the car, she was dead. Emily flung the car door wide. A man in a green t-shirt and blue jeans lunged at her. He looked almost normal except for the twisted, unnatural angle of his neck. She ducked away from him as she pivoted away from the car, away from the man she had hit, away from the murderous mob pursuing her. She didn't slow as she kicked off her platform sandals. Fear propelled her up the long drive, toward the building she had only minutes before never wanted to set eyes on again, as if the devil himself snatched at her heels. Mario Santarello. Wednesday, September 16th, 2026, Mountain View, California. Mario wrenched the steering wheel of his Audi sports coupe right, steering himself against the dull thud of the woman who had darted into the street in front of him. She twirled, thumping against the length of the car, but didn't fall down. In the rearview mirror, he saw her pick up the handgun she had dropped, then continue running down the street. Thank God she hadn't tried to flag him down. He couldn't stop. He downshifted, taking the corner too fast, tires squealing. His brother's house was halfway down the block of picturesque craftsman bungalows. The street was anything but picturesque now. A house in flames belched black smoke skyward. Bodies littered the street, the sidewalks, the lawns. Some of them stirred or sat up. Others dragged themselves along the ground or shuffled slowly. And then there were the fat ones, the fast ones. None of it made sense. Dominic had not been at the door the last 3 times he'd driven past. He wasn't sure how much longer he could circle the block before they were completely cut off from the freeway. This morning, a friend called him from Los Angeles on a sat phone. She'd told him the National Guard had closed all the freeways. He'd found it hard to believe at first. Something like that would be on the news, and people live-streamed everything nowadays. Until she said cell phone and internet service had been down since yesterday morning. That was when he realized this thing was a lot worse than the authorities were letting on. A middle-aged man sprinted across the street, pursued by an obese woman at a speed that should have been impossible for someone so large. Spidery black veins, as if she had blood poisoning, stood in stark relief against the pale flesh of her jiggling arms and dimpled knees. The front of her white nightgown was a blood-soaked red-brown. Smears of blood covered her face, hands, and arms, even her bare feet. The man tripped, sprawling on the sidewalk. He shrieked like an animal in a trap, an animal that knows it's going to die. The woman closed the distance. The man stumbled to his feet, even though he had to be thinking he would never make it. Mario jammed on the brakes, then opened the window. He aimed the Sig Sauer his neighbor had given him at the woman's head as she pounced, praying as he squeezed the trigger. Headshots on moving targets were difficult, especially for a novice with firearms such as he. The man startled at the sharp report of the gun, but did not stop. The woman's head snapped to the side. A shower of black goop exploded from the far side of her head. She dropped to the pavement with a muffled whump. The man had already disappeared. Mario shoved the clutch into first and hit the gas. He saw a twitch of the blinds in the front window of Dominic's house. Oh, thank God. The front door flew open. His younger brother raced to the curb. He clutched a bloody golf club in his hands, and a backpack dangled from his shoulder. He yanked the passenger door open before the car stopped and dove in. "I started to think you weren't coming back," Dominic said over the roar of the Audi's engine. "Where the hell were you?" Mario said, swerving to avoid running over a body. A staccato burst of gunfire sounded behind them. "This is the 4th time I've been around the block. I couldn't. They were outside. I saw you go by, but I couldn't come." Mario glimpsed a blur of motion at the edge of his peripheral vision as they turned the corner. Then the world jarred and jolted, accompanied by a grinding crunch of metal. The car was shoved sideways, hopping the curb onto the sidewalk and smashing into cafe tables and chairs. They came to rest against the front of an upscale restaurant. Its plate glass window shattered with a gunshot-loud crack. A bright yellow table umbrella toppled onto the hood of the car. A blue pickup truck, the blur that Mario had seen, took off. Dominic slammed his hand on the dash. "He didn't even stop!" Mario concentrated on getting back onto the road without snagging the car on one of the metal chairs. When they thumped back over the curb, he floored it. All around them, the stretch of El Camino that ran through Mountain View looked like a war zone. The wail of sirens grew louder by the moment. A pair of burning cars, now permanently entangled, filled the air with choking smoke. Dominic flinched at every burst of gunfire. Fat but lightning-fast, whatever the hell they were, charged up and down and across the streets, intent on catching and eating their neighbors. Others limped along, much slower than the others, but just as dogged in their pursuit. Mario wrenched the Audi's steering wheel back and forth, downshifting and upshifting constantly to get past cars with doors left wide open. "Jim still at work?" Mario asked, stealing a glance at his younger brother. Dominic's face was pale and drawn, his eyes wide. He looked as shell-shocked as Mario felt. "I called him an hour ago. He said everything at Sinalto's campus was fine. He didn't even know what I was talking about." That guy wouldn't notice if water was wet, Mario thought. But fleetingly, he had to keep his attention on the road in front of him. He blew through intersections, heedless of traffic lights. They needed to get off El Camino, but there were only a few major arteries that would get them to I-280. He was afraid to try the side streets after what he had seen while circling Dominic's block. Traffic clogged the road as they neared the turn to El Monte, which led to the freeway. The frustrated bark and hoot of horns filtered through their closed windows. "These things are already here. We can't stop!" Dominic cried, panicked when the Audi slowed. "Shut up, Dom," Mario snapped, trying to think. They would never get through the intersection. Traffic had stopped. People were abandoning their vehicles to flee the hulking figures flitting between them. They only needed to get another 1,000 feet to turn onto El Monte. They could take it all the way to Foothill Expressway if it wasn't too jammed. They should be taking it all the way to 280, but first they had to go to Sinalto to pick up Jim. Mario was so frustrated and scared that he wanted to scream. The last thing they should do was fetch Dominic's boyfriend. He treated Dominic like shit, but that wasn't why Mario didn't want to do it. Something niggled at him just out of reach, insisting that going to Sonalto was a bad idea. Mario wanted to go straight to Genesis and lock himself and Dominic inside the main lab building until everything was under control again. But Dominic thought he was in love with the guy. If Mario refused, he was afraid that Dominic would go on his own and wind up dead. Or worse. He searched frantically for an escape route. They were on the wrong side of the road to cut through the corner shopping center on his left, and had passed the entrance besides. Then he realized the corner around it was landscaped. A car could fit through and get around the clogged intersection. Mario turned, easing the car over the low divider between the lanes. The car behind him, and the one after that, followed. He took the curb onto the sidewalk at a crawl. They couldn't afford the car becoming undrivable. The Audi's wheels spun, kicking up wood chips when he let the clutch out too fast. He let up on the gas enough for the tires to find purchase, then punched it. He winced at the howl of brakes and horns off to his right, followed by grinding metal and a deep boom. A truck had collided with a car. A man hung out of the truck's cab on the driver's side, legs kicking. Blood spattered the inside of the truck's windshield as it skidded and stopped, blocking their path. The Audi shot across the landscaped corner and flew over the curb, landing with an unnerving whoomp. He cranked the steering wheel left and jammed the brakes, barely missing the truck. The Audi fishtailed wildly as he straightened out and hit the gas. He flinched when he realized they were on the wrong side of the road. "You're going the wrong way!" Dominic shouted. The contorted faces of outraged motorists, who didn't realize they were driving to their doom at the gridlocked intersection, swerved out of the way as Mario played a high-speed game of chicken. Adrenaline flooded his sweat-slicked body. Blood rushed in his ears, drowning out the honking horns and squealing tires. When the traffic islands gave way to a center turning lane, he swerved the careening Audi to the correct side of the road. "Slow down, Mario! Jesus!" Nothing was on fire here, but a limping figure with a bloody neck stumbled and tripped over a curb, then climbed to its feet. When they turned right, the road ahead was clear. "Thank God," he gasped. He tried to shift the car into sixth gear, but it wouldn't go. He glanced down to see why. It was already in sixth. When they were half a mile from Foothill Expressway, Mario began to downshift. He let the car drift along at 20 miles per hour. The traffic signals were still working. Nothing was on fire. Cars were not abandoned. A man stood on his lawn with a hose, watering flowers along his driveway. Things looked okay, but he knew it wouldn't last. He swallowed the impulse to shout at the guy, to warn him, but he knew from previous attempts that it would take too long to make him understand, and then he'd look at Mario like he was crazy. There was virtually no traffic on the other side of the intersection beyond the expressway. Traffic on the expressway was heavy, but moving. If they went straight instead of turning left to get Dominic's boyfriend, they might make it to the freeway on time. "We can't go to Sonalto to get Jim," he said, still not sure why he was so certain doing so would be a mistake. "What do you mean, the traffic's fine?" The traffic light was still red. Gently, Mario pressed his foot on the brake, and the thing that he hadn't been able to figure out clicked into place. "It's too close to a hospital." "What?" Dominic said, sounding bewildered. "What's too close to a hospital?" "Sonalto is by a hospital, just like your house. They've been telling people to go to the hospital for 2 days, and now all those people are homicidal or insane. I don't know what they are, but it's spilling out from the hospitals. We can't go." "If you think I'm leaving him..." The light turned green. Mario jammed the clutch into first and peeled through the intersection toward the freeway. "No!" Dominic roared. He grabbed the steering wheel. Its smooth leather wrapping slid under Mario's fingers as the Audi jerked to the right. Mario pulled it back, the tug-of-war bouncing the car like a pinball. Dominic yanked the wheel again and elbowed Mario on the jaw. Mario jammed on the brakes. "Let go, Dominic!" Grinding gears set his teeth tingling when Dominic knocked the gear shift out of gear. The engine stalled as the Audi spun out, then the right rear fender crunched into a parked car. Mario shoved his brother away, stepped on the clutch pedal, and turned the key in the ignition. "Take me with you!" Both men jumped. A young woman banged on Dominic's window. Please take me with you," she begged, starting to cry. She never stopped banging on the window. "We have to get away. They're coming." Mario pressed the button to open the window. She crouched lower so she could see them better. She wore a nice sleeveless blouse and skirt. Stylish clothes for work, but cheap like someone just starting out might buy. Her eyeliner was smudged down to her cheekbones. Her up-twisted hair had half fallen down. Her face was flushed a deep pink, and sweat ran down her temples and neck. "I don't know what they are, but they're killing people, eating people." Mario broke out in a cold sweat. He looked out the window, but everything around them still looked normal. "Where are they?" he demanded. I don't know how far behind they are." Her face screwed up, and she began to cry in earnest. Her whole body shook. Snot ran from her nose that she wiped on her hand. She looked over the roof of the car, like she was checking to see if something had followed her, then crouched back down. "I ran to the building, and they said they would help me," she gasped, her voice rising and falling unevenly. "But then people started screaming, and they were inside. They were inside the building. Nobody listened when I said to run away. They didn't listen, so I ran." What little reserve of composure she had managed to hold on to evaporated. "I lost my phone, and when I asked for help, everyone looked at me like I was crazy. No one would help me," she screeched. "So I ran away." Her breath came in shuddering gasps. She shook so hard that the rest of her hair began to drift down in golden waves. She clutched Dominic's arm through the window, her wild gray eyes imploring them to help her. "You're the only car that stopped." Dominic looked at Mario sidelong, plainly unnerved. They hadn't stopped. They had crashed, and this poor girl thought they were the right people to ask for help. "When was this? Where were you?" Mario said. He needed to know if they could still make it to the freeway. "You don't understand," she said, and for the first time she really did look unhinged. "Please take me with you. We have to—" "Where were you?" Dominic demanded. "My interview," she said with a hiccuping sob. "At Sinalto. I don't know how long ago." Dominic gasped. Mario felt like he was being dragged down into a vat of molasses. She ran from Los Altos, he thought, reeling. That would take half an hour at least, and she was still hysterical with fear. And she'd come from Sinalto, where Dominic's boyfriend was. He'd been right, but fuck. He saw her mouth moving while she tugged on Dominic's arm, and the rapid rise and fall of Dominic's chest, the coil of tension building in his brother's body. Dominic flung the car door open and scrambled out. "Dom, come back!" Mario shouted, starting to open his door to go after him. But Dominic wasn't leaving. He released the latch on the seat and pulled it forward. The girl scrambled in, her feet bare and stockings torn. Dominic dropped back into his seat and slammed the door shut. Mario could see his brother's hands shake as he buckled the seatbelt. Mario peeled out from the curb, accelerating so fast his body pressed into the seat. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The young woman had turned around in the back seat. She looked out the back window. "What's your name?" he asked. She jumped at the sound of his voice, then turned around. "Emily?" Mario glanced at his brother. Dominic looked straight ahead, eyes glassy, jaw clenched, his face a rictus of grief. "I'm Mario," he said. "This is my brother Dominic. You're gonna be okay." Miranda Tucci, Friday, September 18th, 2026, Santa Clara, California. "Miranda?" Sam crouched beside where she was huddled in the corner. From the way he looked at her, Miranda realized this wasn't his first attempt to get her attention. "Is it time?" she asked. Fear made her voice, her whole body shake. "Almost." She took the hand Sam offered and let him pull her to her feet. She could hear the things in the corridor, moaning and scraping, snuffling and shuffling. They had been her friends, her classmates, her roommates a few days ago. She didn't know what they were now. It never stopped, the moaning and scraping and shuffling, a 24-hour-a-day soundtrack. She wanted to scream so she didn't have to hear it for a few seconds. She turned toward the hole in the wall to the adjacent dorm room just as her best friend Karen scrambled through it. "We're ready," Karen said to Sam. She didn't acknowledge Miranda. "I don't think I can do it," Miranda said to Sam, her voice small and unfamiliar. "I don't think I can go out there." Chalky dust from the smashed drywall dusted Karen's chestnut brown skin. As her eyes narrowed and her face contorted, she looked like a vengeful spirit. Miranda braced herself for the verbal barrage sure to follow, but Sam cut Karen off with a gesture. "You can, Miri," he said, still holding her hand in his. He talked to her like she had seen him talk to his 3-year-old nephew. "It's simple. There are holes in the walls between this and the next few rooms. Jill's waiting in the farthest room from here, and I'm going to help her open that door, but it won't open the whole way, so we'll have time to get to the next room. Karen will help push the desk and chairs into place once we're through." "A whole bunch of furniture won't stop them," Miranda protested. "It's not supposed to. We want them to get through. We just need to slow them down a little. By the time we get back here, they'll still be stuck in the first room, but they'll keep following through the holes in the walls. That will clear out the hallway enough so we can reach the stairwell and the roof." "There are people across the courtyard in Benson Center, Miranda. If we can get to the roof, they'll figure out a way to help us," Karen chimed in. For once, she didn't sound angry, but her forbearance felt forced. "How long will we be up there?" Miranda said. Sam shifted closer to her. The shiny silver of his badge glinted where it caught the light, made brilliant by the black shirt of his uniform. "I don't know, but it will be okay. Maybe there's a way to get to a fire escape." Miranda gasped. A cold sweat slicked her body. "But they're everywhere on the ground. We can't go down there, Sam. Sam put his first 2 fingers over her lips. "We'll think of something, okay? But we cannot stay here, Mary. We can't. If we stay here, we're going to die." It brought her up short to hear him say it so plain. She was so focused on staying away from the things. She had ignored the flip side. If they did not get out of this room, they would be just as dead. "What if they're in the stairwell?" she said, knowing her protest was futile, but still needing to hold on to the illusion of the dorm room's safety. Sam brushed a strand of auburn hair away from Miranda's face. "Don't worry about that right now. Stay quiet like you've been doing. If you do that, you'll be okay." Sam's calm voice was no nonsense and brooked no argument. His calm, cop voice. The first time she'd seen him use it was in a bar to de-escalate a disagreement between 2 drunks. Up to that point, she'd never seen a cop de-escalate anything. Impressed, and because he was cute, she'd complimented him as he passed her table. He stopped to talk, and they'd been dating ever since. Sam made what they needed to do sound simple. She knew it wouldn't be. "I got us this far, babe. Trust me, okay?" It was true. Sam was the reason that she, Karen, and Jill were alive. The fear that flooded her brain did not recede. It was just that she trusted Sam more. "Okay." First Karen, then Sam scrambled through the hole in the wall. She wanted to follow after them, but then she would be closer to the things. She heard the low murmur of their voices. Then Karen's head popped back through. "Miranda?" Her voice sounded gentle, like the Karen whom she'd always known. "You have to pull your shit together, and you have to do it now. I love you, hun, but I am not dying for you. If you freeze or do something stupid, I won't come back." Karen ducked back through the hole. Miranda stared at the empty space where Karen had been, a hollow feeling in her chest. Even her best friend thought she was a liability. Alone for the first time in days, an irrational fear that one of the things had gotten into the room seized her. She whirled around. No monsters, but there was an aluminum baseball bat poking out from under the chair in the corner. She picked it up and felt a little better. Raised voices, human voices. Unable to bear not knowing, Miranda ran to look through the hole in the wall. She crouched down for a better sight line. Figures hovered near another hole in another wall. A scream, high and panicked, pierced the grunts and moans. Miranda scuttled back, fumbling with the bat. Were the others dead? Was she left alone? Banging and more shouting, voices coming closer. A shadow appeared on the other side of the hole to the next room, and she realized she was going to die in this crappy dorm. When Karen bolted through, she smothered a scream. It's Karen, she told herself. Sam crawled through and sprang to his feet. He and Karen flipped the single bed frame on its side and shoved it in front of the hole. Where's Jill? Miranda said. Didn't make it, Sam answered, his voice tight and face pinched. Karen crouched beside the hole to the next room, adjusting the pistol in her waistband. The ones that aren't eat. Karen stopped, then added softly. They're sniffing around the first barricade. Shh, said Sam. He knelt on the desk that barricaded the door to the hallway. He leaned in, his ear to the door. Minutes ticked by. They're through, Karen whispered. Moans began to emanate from the rooms beside them. The sharp stench of decaying bodies wafted through the hole. How can it smell worse than what's coming from the hallway? Miranda thought, her stomach heaving. No one spoke. Miranda closed her eyes. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of death. Hail Mary, full of grace. They're through the second barricade, Karen whispered. Miranda opened her eyes, not sure how much time had passed while she'd been praying on a non-stop loop. Sam eased off the desk. He and Karen lifted it carefully, as if it were made of spun sugar, and quietly moved it away from the door. Sam put his ear to the door again. He looked over to Miranda and mouthed silently, It's working. Karen joined them at the door. Her body seemed to vibrate like a tightly wound spring poised for attack, for action. Miranda tried to take a deep breath, but her lungs wouldn't cooperate. The room seemed to shrink. Her ears started buzzing. She jumped when a hand closed around her wrist. It's okay, Sam said softly. Just breathe. Look at me. Miranda nodded. She tried to breathe, gripped the bat tighter. Sam's focus shifted. She followed his gaze and saw a grasping, bloody hand reach through the small gap at the top of the hole in the wall. Sam pulled the dull black truncheon from his utility belt. He nodded to Karen. With a torpid deliberateness, Karen unlocked the deadbolt. She gripped the doorknob and looked at Sam. Stay next to me, Mary, Sam whispered. He looked at Karen. Do it. Karen eased the door open. Sam looked into the hallway, then turned back and nodded. Karen opened the door wider. Sam stepped into the hallway, pulling Miranda with him. She half stumbled before righting herself. When she looked down the hallway, her body froze. Dozens of moaning things shoved and pushed into the room 3 doors down. Puddles of congealing blood slicked the floors and walls. Without air conditioning, the hallway felt stifling, close and hot like cotton packed tight. Panic exploded inside Miranda's chest. Her knees felt watery. After spending so much time trying to be quiet, the grunts and moans of the things sounded amplified, so much it almost hurt her ears. When she felt the tug of Sam's hand on her arm, she yelped. The heads of the things in the hallway turned toward them. Distraction compromised, they bolted down the corridor. Sam reached the stairwell door first and eased it open, then opened it wider and stepped through. He turned back and motioned for Miranda and Karen to follow. As Karen stepped through the door, she cried out and was yanked backwards. Miranda caught Karen's hand. Their outstretched arms kept the heavy metal door to the stairwell open. Let go, Miranda, save yourself! Karen had said she wouldn't die for Miranda, but if she let go of her hand right now, she would, and Miranda would live. Karen wouldn't even hold it against her. No. The voice was so loud, so distinct and sure that if Miranda hadn't known they were alone, she would have looked to see who had spoken. Deep in her belly, something stirred. A hot, furious anger welled up, detonating inside her chest. She felt light and strong instead of heavy and weak. She felt fearless, not like a victim praying for an end to her suffering. She was not going to die today. Neither was Karen. Miranda rammed the heavy door with her right shoulder. She jammed her foot against it to get its weight off of hers and Karen's arms. Karen stretched between Miranda and the thing like an accordion paper doll. The thing tried to reach down for a bite, but every time it did, it started to lose its footing. But more things were just steps behind the one that had Karen, and more behind them, all the way down the hallway. Miranda still held the bat in her right hand, but that shoulder was keeping the door open. She couldn't swing overhead without Karen being pulled away. An underhand swing would only hit Karen. Then she saw the pistol still tucked inside the waistband of Karen's jeans. Miranda dropped the bat. She grabbed Karen's wrist with both hands and heaved. Karen struggled forward 2 steps. She let go of Karen's arm with her right hand and snatched the pistol. Then she pivoted right, swinging her arm up, and fired point blank in the thing's face. A thundering boom echoed off the concrete walls. Black vapor misted the air. The noisy moans receded behind a static buzz. The thing crumpled to the ground, and Karen stumbled forward. As Karen scrambled past her, Miranda fired the pistol at the next one and the next. She took 2 steps backward into the doorway. Faintly she heard, "Miranda, come on!" She glanced up. Sam shouted at her from the stairs. So did Karen, but she could barely hear them through the buzz in her ears. She stepped backward into the doorway. As she pulled the door shut, it caught on the foot of the next thing. She raised the pistol, but then Sam was beside her. "Leave it." She let go of the cool metal bar, felt a shove of Sam's hand in the small of her back. Side by side, they sprinted the stairs to catch up with Karen. She didn't know what the next threat would be, but she couldn't worry about what if she wanted to live. And she did. She wanted to live with a ferocity that frightened her. They reached the door to the roof. Sam pushed it open, slow and cautious. When she followed him through the door, she'd see what came next. But this time, she would be ready to fight. You've been listening to Undead Age Origin Stories, an Undead Age series novella. Want more? The Undead Age audiobooks are coming spring 2021. Sign up for my newsletter at amgeever.com to get advance notice of the release. Written by A.M. Geever. Narrated and produced by Jeannie Marshall. Copyright 2020 A.M. Geever. Production copyright 2020 by A.M. Geever.